I thought I was just giving a home to a frightened little boy who had never spoken a single word in his life. That's all I thought I was doing. I had no idea that the small, tarnished medallion hanging around his neck, the one I almost threw away because it looked like nothing more than a piece of old junk, was the most dangerous secret in the entire kingdom. And I had absolutely no idea that powerful men, men with titles and armies and everything to lose, had spent years making sure that secrets stayed buried. But here's what I need you to understand before I tell you anything else. By the time this story ends, you will know exactly why one silent little boy, a child who couldn't say a single word, changed the future of an entire kingdom. And you will understand why his silence was never a tragedy. It was his greatest protection. To understand why I opened the convent door that cold morning, you first need to understand who I was before any of this happened. My name is Sister Marguerite. I had lived inside the walls of St. Hilara's convent for nearly 18 years. It was a quiet life, and I loved it. I woke before sunrise every single morning. I prayed, I tended the garden, I taught reading to abandoned children in the village nearby. My days were simple, and I was grateful for every one of them. I believed then, as I believe now, that every child who comes into this world deserves to be loved not because of where they come from, not because of what they own, not because of who their parents are, just because they exist. That belief had shaped my entire life. It had led me to this convent, to this calling, and eventually, it led me to him. It was a November morning, the kind of morning where the fog sits so low on the ground you can barely see your own feet. One of our older sisters came rushing to find me and told me there was a child at the gate. Just a child, standing alone, no adult with him, no note, nothing. I pulled my shawl tight and walked outside, and that is when I first saw him. He was small, maybe 4 years old, though I couldn't be sure. His coat was torn at both shoulders. His shoes were too large for his feet, clearly not his own. He had dark eyes that were so still, so watchful, that they reminded me of someone who had already learned that the world was not safe. He was clutching the front of his coat with both hands, and underneath it, just barely visible at his collar, was a small medallion on a worn cord. I remember thinking it looked old, much too old to belong to a child. But in that moment, I was only thinking about getting him inside and warm. I knelt down in front of him. I said, "Hello, little one, you're safe here." He didn't answer. He didn't nod. He just looked at me with those enormous dark eyes. I held out my hand, and after a long moment, a moment that felt like it lasted forever, he reached out and took it. He never spoke. Not that day. Not for a long time after. We brought in a physician who told us there was no physical reason for his silence. His throat was fine, his hearing was fine. Whatever was keeping him quiet, it lived somewhere much deeper than his body. Some of the other sisters whispered that he was broken. I told them to stop. I told them he was healing. Those are two very different things. I named him Elias. The first weeks were slow. He would sit at the table for meals but never touched his food unless I sat beside him. He slept on the cot in the small room I'd arranged for him, but twice I found him curled up outside my door in the middle of the night, just sitting there in the dark, waiting, not crying, just waiting. I started leaving my door open after that. Trust between us didn't come from grand moments. It came from small ones. It came from me reading to him every evening, even though he never responded. It came from planting seeds together in the garden and watching his face change when something actually grew. It came from the afternoon I caught him watching me braid a prayer cord, and he reached over without a word and helped me finish it, his tiny fingers somehow knowing exactly what to do. I thought about that for days afterward. Where had he learned something like that? There were other things I noticed, things I couldn't explain. When one of the village officials visited the convent and greeted the children, Elias stood and gave a slow, formal bow, the kind of bow you only see in royal courts, not in orphanages. The official didn't notice, but I did. Another time, an older sister was humming an old folk melody in the kitchen, and Elias stopped walking, turned his head, and pressed one hand flat against the wall as if the song physically touched him. When I asked him later, through the one-sided conversations we had where I talked and he listened, if he recognized that song, he looked at me for a long moment and then looked away. That was the closest thing to an answer I ever got from him in those early months. The medallion. I kept coming back to it. He never took it off, not even when he bathed. It was small, about the size of a large coin, and it had a crest engraved on it. A bird with one wing outstretched and two stars beneath it. I didn't recognize the symbol. I showed it to our eldest sister, and she went pale in a way I had never seen before. She told me to put it away and to never show it to anyone who came to the convent asking about a lost child. I asked her why. She said she would explain when the time was right. She died 3 weeks later without ever telling me anything more. That was when I started to become afraid. The visitors started arriving around the time Elias had been with us for nearly a year. Men I had never seen before. Traveling officials, they called themselves. They asked careful questions about abandoned children, about whether any boy had been brought to us recently, about whether we had noticed anything unusual. I told them no. Every single time. I told them no. And I looked them directly in the eye, and I felt my heart hammering against my ribs because I absolutely knew that Elias was exactly who they were looking for. The night after the third set of visitors came, I sat alone in the chapel for hours. I asked myself every question I was afraid to answer. What if he was a stolen child? What if his family was out there desperately looking for him? What if keeping him here was wrong? But then I thought about those visitors. I thought about the coldness in their eyes. I thought about the way one of them had surveyed the children during a meal, slowly, methodically, like he was searching for an object rather than a person. And I made a decision that night that changed everything. I decided that protecting Elias mattered more than protecting myself. Whatever truth was out there, I was not going to let those men reach him before I understood it myself. I began quietly searching through the convent's oldest records. Letters, donation logs, visitor registries going back decades. And buried deep inside a crumbling wooden chest in the cellar, I found something that made me sit down on the cold stone floor and not move for a very long time. It was a letter, sealed with a wax imprint of a bird with one wing outstretched and two stars beneath it, the same crest as the medallion. The letter was addressed to our late elder sister, the one who had gone pale when I showed her the pendant. It was dated 5 years earlier. It was from a woman named only as E, and it said 3 things that I will never forget as long as I live. It said the child must never be found by those who took the throne. It said the medallion is his proof and his danger. And it said, when the time comes, he will speak. Elias was 6 years old the morning he spoke his first words to me. We were in the garden. Early light. The kind of golden morning that makes everything look like it's been painted. He had been watching a small bird building a nest in the corner of the stone wall. I was beside him, not saying anything, just being there with him the way I always was, and then, without looking at me, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, so quiet I thought I had imagined it, he said, "She used to sing to me, before everything went dark." I didn't move. I was afraid if I moved, the moment would break. He turned and looked at me with those dark, steady eyes, and he said, "I remember the song, the one Sister Helena hums in the kitchen. My mother sang it." I took his hand. I didn't ask him anything. I just held his hand and I let him have the memory in peace. After that, the words came slowly, like water through a crack in stone, not all at once, but steadily. He told me fragments, a large house with tall windows, a woman with dark hair who called him by a different name, men who came in the night, being carried by someone who kept whispering that he needed to be quiet, that he needed to stay quiet no matter what, that his silence was the only thing that would keep him alive. I took the letter and the medallion to an elderly historian in the nearest city. A man I trusted completely. He studied the crest for less than a minute before looking up at me with an expression I will never forget. He told me that the crest belonged to the House of Verlaine, a royal family whose youngest son had been declared dead 6 years earlier under circumstances that had never fully been explained. He told me the throne had passed to a distant branch of the family immediately after. He told me that several loyal servants of the House of Verlaine had disappeared around the same time. And he told me that if the boy was who the medallion suggested he was, then there were people currently holding significant power who could not afford for him to be found alive. The revelation didn't come with thunder. It came quietly, the way the most important truths always do. Elias was the lost prince of Verlaine, the child I had bathed and fed and read to every night, the boy who helped me braid prayer cords and who cried silently into my shoulder the first time he trusted me enough to cry. The one who learned to laugh, really laugh, for the first time in our garden among the tomatoes and the marigolds. He was the rightful heir to an entire kingdom. What followed was the hardest season of my life. Loyal allies of the old royal family came forward carefully, one by one. A hidden journal written by a royal servant confirmed everything. Legal scholars authenticated the medallion and the bloodline records. And the men who had installed themselves comfortably in power since the so-called death of the young prince, they fought hard to bury it all again. They sent more visitors. They spread false stories. They tried to discredit the historian, the records, and me personally. One official even came to the convent and told me directly that I was confused, that I was an uneducated woman who had attached myself emotionally to a common orphan, and that I should hand him over immediately for his own protection. I looked that man in the eye and told him that the day I handed Elias to someone who looked at a child the way he did would be the last day I drew breath. He left. He did not come back. The truth, once it begins moving, is very difficult to stop. Within a year, enough evidence had come forward that the matter could no longer be quietly suppressed. Elias the Prince, my boy, stood before the council that reviewed the evidence. He was 7 years old. He stood straight and still, and when they asked him to speak, he spoke. Quietly, clearly, without a single tremor in his voice. He described the house with the tall windows. He described the song. He showed them the medallion, and he said, "My name is Elias of Verlaine, and I am not afraid any more." The kingdom did not change overnight. Change never does. But it changed. The false claimants were removed from power through the legal processes that the evidence demanded. The loyal servants who had protected Elias with their own lives and identities stepped forward at last. Restorations were made, and Elias, my quiet, patient, extraordinary boy, began the long journey of learning what it meant to lead a nation. He insisted on one thing before he left the convent. He sat beside me in the chapel, the two of us alone, and he told me that everything he knew about compassion, about listening, about treating every person as worthy of dignity, he learned it within these walls. He told me that a crown can be given and taken away, but what I had taught him could never be removed. I held his face in both hands the way I had when he was 4 years old and terrified at the gate. And I told him that I had never once thought of him as a prince. I had only ever thought of him as mine. He is a king now, and he still writes to me every single month without fail. His letters always begin the same way. They begin with the words, "Dear Mother Marguerite," not "Dear Sister," not "Dear Nun," Mother. And that, I think, is the only title that has ever truly mattered to either one of us. So I want to ask you something before you go. Do you believe that love defines a family, or do you believe blood does? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that greatness is not born from a crown, but from kindness, patience, and the courage to love someone no one else was willing to, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone out there needs this story more than you know.